Greetings, everyone. Today is Monday, September 21st, and here is today's Monday Morning Minute. And I hope that this brief message finds you well and safe and enjoying the clean air that we can now breathe. It's such a miraculous gift, and I'm really trying hard not to ever take it for granted again. And I hope you all have been enjoying it as well. So for today, we'll look briefly back at last week's readings. We'll then talk about this week's readings. I want to then introduce you to our second major assignment called the Teacher Interview Project. And finally, I want to just provide a gentle reminder that our first major assignment is due this Sunday, and that's the Teaching Metaphor Project. So this entire class thus far, we've been talking about assessment and the education debt, and I envision our readings and our discussions kind of circling around in the orbit of this tension created by assessment and the education debt. And so last week we read a piece by Richard Milner. We also looked at the introduction to Joe Feldman's book, Grading for Equity. And we, as usual, synthesized a lot of really interesting ideas and questions that I wanted to bring to the larger forum. So to start us off, we have Shannon who writes, assessments should be used for promoting student growth and learning rather than rating students or comparing them to others. If the grades are posted in the classroom, even if it is anonymous with student ID numbers, students are going to begin comparing themselves, and it can be disheartening rather than encouraging. While it's important for a student to know where they are in the class in terms of how well they're doing, I don't like the idea of even accidentally throwing it in their faces if they aren't doing as well as their peers. And so Shannon has crystallized a really common practice, and I'm glad that she's critiquing it as well. And this is thought to be sort of a motivating factor for students, where we track our growth as a class, and as such, maybe we have code names for students, specific students, or we use their ID numbers or things like that. But I think it raises a larger question of its relationship to true learning, and if we're trying to coerce students to learn because they don't want to be behind their peers, is that learning for the right reasons? Is it even effective? Will it even work? And I think Shannon brings up some other, how it might be actually non-motivational, unmotivational, demotivational, right? And students can feel really disheartened if they realize that, oh my goodness, I'm way behind my peers according to this data. So Shannon, thank you for bringing that up. And Melissa, relatedly, asks a really interesting question that I want to throw to you all. So Melissa wrote, assignments are often deemed by students as worthy of completing based upon the percentage of points it will earn them. I'm totally guilty of this. Melissa, me too. How do we encourage them to continue doing the work if not every little piece is worth points? And I think this is a great question. And I think embedded, like an assumption within this question, is that students will only do things, or why do something if it's not worth points, if it doesn't affect the bottom line. And I realize, Melissa's question prompts me to think a little bit more deeply about how we've structured the system that way. It's not a surprise that students don't see something as worth doing if it's not worth points or not worth a lot of points, because we've built assessment systems that way, right? To reward some students for complying and to punish other students who aren't complying, right? So this is a really fantastic question. I think it's super relevant. And it's something that I hope that we can continue to think about together. How can we encourage students to do things that are worthwhile if perhaps it doesn't have a huge point value assigned to it? Okay, so thinking about this week, so we're kind of entering this new unit, and I had hoped that the first chunk of readings would speak to this larger question of like, why assessment? Why does it matter? And I hope an answer that we've arrived at is that it's important. We have to know for our own practice where our students are. And of course, that assessment should take multiple different forms and should look as diverse as the students are themselves. But now in this second unit, I want us to think about what are the nuts and bolts of assessment. And in our conversations and in the critical responses that I've seen from you all, it seems like we have a pretty firm baseline understanding of concepts like formative assessment and summative assessment, etc. And our reading this week is just designed to perhaps remind us of those and kind of how they work together. My goals for this course are both that you can kind of speak the language of assessment that is commonly spoken in schools, so you will be fluent in that language. I also want you to think beyond the ways that summative and formative assessments are typically carried out within schools. And that's a tension, I think, in all of education, right? How do we prepare the people that we're working with for the world that is, and also to prepare them to change it and to make it better. And so I'm striking that balance, or at least I'm trying to strike that balance this week. And the handout I've prepared for you all is one part of that larger plan. And so this is just a handout. I've adapted it heavily from an open educational resource. And if you don't know about open educational resources, they're really fantastic. And their mission is just to equalize learning, to make learning accessible by providing high quality resources that are free, that anyone can use. And often, depending on the license, you can change and you can adapt as well. So I'm going to navigate actually over to that handout just so you can see what it looks like. Here it is. Okay. And it's several pages long, but it has a lot of big images. And I think the images are actually really important. So do please take a look at those. But as I mentioned, this is just a way to kind of get us all on the same page in terms of these larger concepts, like summative and formative assessment, and to think a little bit about this idea of scaffolding, which we'll talk about later in the semester when we get to the question of how to design assessments in ways that are culturally responsive and culturally sustaining. And some key ideas here to point out to you all. First of all, an article by Kaftan and Buck, I think from 2014, is used as an illustrative example. And I think it's a really powerful one too. And there's a link to the article itself that you can access, and you can read through the article if you'd like to. It's a research piece. But they really draw out this notion that assessment needs to focus on student understanding and not simply their ability to replicate a series of steps in order to get a passing grade on the assessment or the assignment. And again, I won't say too much about that, but I think it is a really cool study that they did, and it has really clear, I think, implications for us as educators. Then the handout goes into this idea of 4 different domains of assessment. So this is, if you know Bloom's taxonomy, this is more or less in line with that, going from knowledge mastery, so, being able to share a brief answer, like in a multiple choice question, let's say, do you know what these concepts mean, all the way up to, can you actually create something? Can you draw on this previous knowledge, your reasoning skills, etc., and create something new? And so they've got this cool matrix near the end of that handout that juxtaposes these 4 domains of assessment alongside 4 different kind of buckets or containers of assessment methods. And again, these also are more or less in line with Bloom's taxonomy. So something like selected response, again, a multiple choice item, through performance assessment, and even like personal communication, having an interview, a discussion with students as a way to assess them. Again, I am hopeful that this is useful and that it kind of gets us on the same page as we go on and think more deeply about how to construct formative assessments. It says in the handout, and I'll just say it again to you all, that we'll focus a lot more on formative assessments than we will summative assessments, in part because formative assessments should occur very regularly. That's the feedback point for both students and for ourselves as educators in terms of what we need to change, how we need to adapt. And so therefore, formative assessments, even though they're worth less points, to go back to Melissa's question, are actually far more important than the summative assessment in terms of our day-to-day teaching and planning. Okay, so now I'm going to navigate us away, and we'll talk about our second upcoming project, which is the teacher interview. It's due October 18th, so still a couple of weeks away. And just so you know, this is typically how things will go, in that I'll make a point to introduce an assignment several weeks in advance of its due date. And that's just to help you think through it, to share any additional information with you. So you can count on me and trust me to do that. Okay, so here's the teacher interview project assignment description. And I am asking you, as part of your readings this week, to look it over for yourself. But basically, We're talking a lot about assessment, of course, because that is the title of this course. But I want you also to get a sense of how assessment looks in the context of your field experience. That is huge. And there is such a divide along so many axes when it comes to what teacher education programs, such as the one that you're in, talk about in terms of pedagogy, in terms of curriculum, in terms of practice, and then what happens in schools. And this is a huge theory, research, practice divide, and one that I'm hoping through this assignment we can start to close. So basically what I'm asking you to do is to interview a teacher about assessment. I'm going to ask you to first identify a teacher, ideally one who's in your content area and one who's willing to sit down with you for an hour. Hopefully this is your current mentor teacher, that you don't have to go look around for another teacher, but if you would rather talk to somebody else and maybe you need some help identifying another teacher, let me know. We can work our programmatic skills on this end and perhaps suggest some other folks for you. But again, ideally, it's just the person that you're building a relationship with right now. I'd then like you to script out some questions about assessment. You can focus on one aspect of assessment that's really interesting to you, perhaps thinking about assessment and its relationship to learning, assessment and its relationship to educational justice. It can be kind of zeroed in, or it can be like a range of questions that you can just ask about assessment generally. So I've given you some starters here. How do you use assessment in your class? What kinds of assessments do you use? What role do assessments play in your planning and teaching? How are assessments linked to student growth? How is student growth measured, etc.? Again, you do not have to use these questions. These are just there as an example to maybe get you started. And then you'll go ahead and interview your teacher. I would consider recording the interview just so you have the transcript, but of course obtain their permission beforehand. And then during the interview, if you've set aside this hour-long chunk of time, can be intimidating maybe as the questioner and perhaps as the participant as well. But get your participant talking a little bit. You can feel free to stray from those questions, particularly if they share something interesting. You could ask, what's an example of that's happened to you? Or can you tell me more about that? That will put them at ease, that will get them to open up, and you'll get a lot more information that way. And then whether you're recording the interview or not, just make sure to also take notes by hand. That's really helpful too when you go to analyze your interview. And also it can help you formulate new questions and take note of them in the moment. And then once you have that interview and you've conducted it, I'd like you to analyze it. And I'm looking for an essay of 750 to 1,000 words. I didn't include it here. If you're interested in doing something that's not a traditional essay, that is maybe, again, a voice thread or a narrated prezi or something like that, totally always on the table. So if you're more multimodal focused, that's totally fine. And so I'd like you to, from that interview, identify 2 to 3 major themes and put those themes in conversation with what we've been reading in our course. So I'm looking for you to cite at least 3 readings from our course thus far that, again, interface in some way with the themes that you generated from your interview. And I want to note, too, that perhaps there's an assessment practice that your teacher describes that's maybe totally antithetical to a reading that we've done. That's also fine. You can bring in that additional reading to show how they're different. And you can do that also without casting judgment necessarily. And then the last piece of this analysis I'm asking for is some discussion of the implications of your teacher's perspectives on educational justice more broadly. So kind of zooming out, as we did at the very start of this class, and thinking about how might this teacher's assessment practices relate to the achievement gap or the education debt. How do you see these in conversation with one another? So some helpful tips. Please reach out to your teacher/interviewee as soon as possible. We all know that this is a crazy busy semester. And so reaching out with enough advance notice will just ensure that it can actually happen. You can actually do it. If, by the way, your teacher is too busy and they will not be able to kind of work within this time frame, let me know. Again, we can certainly adjust this to ensure that you're able to complete this and that your teacher is not overwhelmed by this request. And then just something helpful, if you can, try to draft a list of questions ahead of time before the interview and send them to your teacher so that they have a chance to look over them. That can really help facilitate some more thoughtful answers. And here's the assignment grading sheet. Pretty simple, but if you have questions, you can let me know. So yeah, again, please do review this in depth on your own and let me know if there are any concerns that you see. Okay. So for this week, again, your gentle reminder, we do have that teaching metaphor project that we talked about a couple weeks ago. That is due this Sunday, the 27th at 11:59 p.m. And I'm going to ask you to submit it, as with everything, via Blackboard. But again, there's always caveats. So if Blackboard is, for whatever reason, not working, you can definitely send it to me via email. I prefer Blackboard. It just makes it easier. And then from a record-keeping perspective, it's important for the university to have a clear and up-to-date record of all of the work that you completed for this class. So Blackboard, of course, is like first choice, but come 11:58 p.m. on Sunday, if Blackboard is down or whatever aspect is just not working, don't freak out. Just send it to me via email. Totally cool. Now I want to show you in our course how to get there, just in case. Again, I don't want there to be any confusion here. Okay, so within our Blackboard course, we'll just go to assignments and then click on Teaching Metaphor Project. Here again, here's the assignment description, and then this little icon here, that denotes a built-in Blackboard assessment. So you can click there, and here's where you can write your submission, I guess, if you want to just do it all in Blackboard, or you can attach a file here. All right, friends, take care of each other, take care of yourself, and let me know if there are any questions or concerns. And I'm so excited to review your teaching metaphor projects. All right, cheers.